All right, y'all. So we're looking at part one, pre-colonial South Africa, the formation of the Union of South Africa. So really, it's prehistory to 1910. My first two slides, just if you need to pause it to locate those places, totally awesome. But let's go ahead and look at who were the first South Africans. I think it's really important that you realize that South Africa was not an empty wasteland ready for colonization prior to the first European. So, very important that you recognize there is a complex society that was developing here. And let's go jump in. First group, we're going to look at the Quesian peoples. They were the indigenous to this region. We see the different groups here. We're just going to identify them in general as Quesian. And very important when we look at this group of people to realize we're not sure exactly how they got there, but we know that they're the indigenous peoples. And in that end, they are hunter gatherers and pastoralists. And as you see, they take up an entire area of that South Africa, and they created complex societies. So again, very interesting element there. So that's the first group. Well, around the year 500, the Bantus began to migrate, and we see this map here. I think it's really important you realize we only use the word Bantu at this moment, and as we're studying it historically. We wouldn't go there and say, hey, who are the Bantu people today? It's not a word that's typically in current use. But historically, the Bantu, as you noticed up there, they originated up here at what we call the Sahel, and they migrated down around 500. We're not sure exactly what caused it. Was it a natural disaster? Was there warfares? There's some archaeological evidence if you're interested. But the most important thing that you know about the Bantu tribes, the Bantu chiefdoms, is they brought agriculture. They knew how to cultivate land. And interesting enough, the Khoisan people did not adopt this. They continue to remain the pastoralists and area. So it's again a very interesting element there. We can do an anthropological look here if you wanted to for your future EE. But again, interesting stuff. The Dutch arrived, and yes, the Portuguese bump into this area, but they don't really impact this area at all. And this is a painting. I love this painting because it really demonstrates what I feel about the Dutch here. Here we see Jan van Riebeeck. He comes in. You see that it's a romantic painting. You have the Dutch national flag. They're bringing in civilization, and the indigenous peoples are just in awe of them. And this is not a factual painting. This painting is done to romanticize. This painting was done in the mid to the late 19th century to demonstrate this concept of the Dutch identity, the Afrikaner identity. When I think of the Dutch, what we know, the Dutch East India Company established Cape Colony, and they did this in the 1600s to serve as a resupply. It's a resupply colony for the Dutch East Indies as they were going to the Spice Islands. It was meant to be temporary. They were not anticipating any planned group. They do bring Calvinism to the South Africa. Remember, what's the most important word? The elect or predestination. The Calvinists viewed themselves as the God's chosen people. That's a really important element because by the 1890s, the Afrikaners will merge that Calvinism concept of the elect to social Darwinism. This really increased tensions to the Africans because now the Afrikaners not only believe that God chose them, but scientifically they were superior according to social Darwinism. And this is really going to create this tight superiority complex for the Afrikaners as we begin to kind of develop this. In the 18th century, there was going to be beginnings of the Trek migration, the Trek Boer migration. The Dutch East India Company really began to weaken. They realized they had to disband Cape Town, but the population had really increased. And really, there was in the Netherlands, there was really no place for them. So they basically said, "Hey, Boers, we don't care what you do. You just can't do it up in Europe." And they began to move into these areas. Boers turned into what we call Trek Boers. Boers is the general term for Dutch farmers. The Trek Boers are the colonizers. And this really led to the decline of the Khoisan peoples as they weren't able to compete against this highly formal regulated group of trek boars. As they begin to migrate, they're utilizing their guns, their different elements of agriculture, and it really is. It's almost as if we might even call it like an ethnic cleansing. It's just going to push the Caucasian people out. Then we look at the arrival of the British. The British, they come in. The Napoleonic Wars really caused the Dutch East India Company to collapse completely. The Dutch are losing their colonies. The British win them. And the British took over Cape Colony in South Africa. I do want to point out they were very disinterested in the racial conflicts within South Africa. And they actually early on wanted to utilize class distinction rather than race discrimination. And that race distinction, class distinction, they were hoping to downplay the Afrikaners because the British did not particularly like the perspective of the Afrikaners. The Afrikaners believed the British were colonizers, invaders, really kind of an interesting turn of events there with that language. Here we see the first British colonists coming their area. But again, the British are arriving. They're arriving by 1820. So from 1808 to 1820, the Afrikaners are frustrated. The Africans are continuously be frustrated. And we see this element. This is a book that I want to pick up this summer, The Boer Invasion of the Zulu Kingdom. This really deals with the Great Trek. But how did the Boers react to the British rule? The Boers believed that they were the true Afrikaners, rejecting the British constraints. They believed they were the elect. So the Trek Boers began to do deeper migrations into eastern South Africa to rid themselves of British rule. They create what's two states, Transvaal and Orange Free State. And they're establishing for themselves this civilization in which they believe God has given them. The British initially ignored the rebellious Boers, and they were trying to figure out how can we handle this? Because again, for them, South Africa had no real economic importance. It was more about a symbol of national pride to expand your empire. Well, those Boer migrations are really going to trigger and disrupt South Africa. It's going to disrupt the Africans. It's going to disrupt the British rule. And in general, it's going to create the atmosphere for the South African War. A guy that's on your reading I do think is fascinating, Shaka Zulu. I want to point out, I look at Shaka Zulu as no different than Henry VII of England. He's a nation, he's a state builder, kingdom builder, just like Henry VII was. And he's going to use violence to do so, just like Henry VII did with throughout the War of the Roses, Court of the Star Chamber, and his spies. So I want to point out Shaka Zulu has there is a lot of misinformation about him, almost like painting him as savagery. But in the end, Shaka Zulu was a well advanced king of the Zulu nation. And from 1616 to 1828, he oversaw the formation of the Zulu kingdom. He was utilizing his more advanced Zulu warfare to centralize the different chiefdoms. The chiefdoms were divided groups within the Zulu nation, and he utilized warfare just like Louis XIV, just like Henry VII, and what he did was use warfare to centralize the state. There is a controversial role with the concept of Methkene, and we'll talk about that in a hot second. But clearly, people were frustrated, and it forced a temporary migration and chaos. And what was the Methkene? Well, the Methkene is defined as the time of troubles. And we see that this is the role of Zulu expansion. I really like this map here. You can pause it to see kind of the migration patterns. There was a role of the slave trade. Europeans, as most countries in the world had ended the African slave trade, didn't necessarily end slavery, but the importation, human trafficking was outlawed. Europeans, the slavers would come in and illegally take it. It created some anxiety there. We're not quite sure all of this with documentation. Though there's no consensus on a cause, the impact was devastating. The Methkene actually is a very controversial concept today. It's because of the way historians look at it. The Afrikaners used it. The Afrikaner historians weaponized the Methkene. They said, hey, the Methkene is illustration that the Africans were savages. They were competitive, where the Trek Boers were civilized. The Africans were not. And they would utilize this idea that it created empty space. In today's world, most South African historians reject that concept and really paint it a little differently. If you want to know more about that, definitely look that up. Some interesting reads out there. But regardless of that, the Great Trek occurred. The Great Trek occurred as the big cause the British were frustrated, the Mefkene aspect. And really by the 1830s, we really have this rough and rugged national identity. It's soon to be called the Afrikaners, and the idea that they're the civilized Africans. They're the ones that bring about culture and civilization. And we see this element there from Cape Colony, they go all the way up to Transvaal, as I've talked about already. And this is another element. So as Mefkene has been weaponized to prove the Africans were savage, Battle of Blood River will be weaponized to romanticize God's hand in history. Some of the facts about this, it seems that there's 12 to 20,000 Zulu warriors versus 700 Trek boars. Here we see a great illustration. Looks very similar to what you might see in the Wild Wild West in America. You have the circling the wagons to create a fortress against the invaders. And reportedly, there's over 3,000 Zulu casualties and only 3 on the Trekboard side. So what happened is the importance here is in 1838, it appears that this is really not that important. There was this oath that was taken, but most people at the time, this was not something that was heavily discussed throughout Africa, South Africa. But what will happen in the 1890s? The Battle of Blood River will be weaponized, over romanticized to really demonstrate that God chose the Dutch settlers. God has chose the Afrikaners. This was a great element. In some ways, the Battle of Blood River reminds me a little bit of Manifest Destiny. The idea that, of course, we won, so therefore God is on our side. Really important elements. This December 16th will be used at the Afrikaners through apartheid to be almost their Independence Day. We'll see a little bit more about that a little bit later. But Battle of Blood River very much utilized in a different way. Here we see, I love this painting of a 1909. It really demonstrates that rough and rugged, pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. I'm not even sure what that means, but again, that idea that these are the great white Afrikaners trekking away, forging themselves a civilization. But again, remember, this is all mythical. It is created to demonstrate the Afrikaner identity. In some ways, it means more to 1909 than it actually did in the 1830s. Really important element there. Now, as we've discussed, we've identified the Khoisan, we've identified the Bantu tribes, we've identified the Afrikaners, we've identified the British. Now we're going to see the Indians. South African Indians in the 1860s, Natal was seen as a great place for these sugar plantations. So you're going to have forced migration of these quote unquote indentured servants. And again, there's something else you can study if you want to. Natal, South Africa becomes a real big center. Today's world, really, one of my son's best friends is a college student at Roanoke, and he's a South African Indian named Han. Really cool, kind of cool stuff when you begin to realize that this history that still lingers, that's still here today. But with that said, this becomes populated by a group of South African Indians. And this really begins to push us towards now, instead of just the anthropological, instead of just looking at the idea of the different peoples, we're now going to talk about the Mineral Revolution and the South African War. Sometimes we call that South African War the Boer War. I do think the reading does a better job at this, explaining that when we think of the Boer War, we do ignore the plight of the Africans and the role of Africans. We'll see that as we talk. So up to this point, the British they found the Afrikaners to be pesty, a little frustrated with them. They saw the Africans as more colonized people, and the British were really, in some ways, ready to just move on with their lives. Then everything changes, and this really is under the leadership of Cecil Rhodes, that we talked about a little bit earlier with imperialism. But from 1867 throughout the 1870s, diamonds and gold are found throughout Kimberley and De Beers. The problem with the gold was really poor quality, really needed cheap labor. This is labor intensive mining, and they needed cheap because, again, they wanted to make profit. So what do? I love what your book does here. It illustrates the shift from class-based to race-based. England realized they had to maximize the labor, which is the African labor, by appeasing the Afrikaners. And here's a image of what deep mining looks like. You see why it's so labor intensive. Johannesburg becomes a key urban area, really out of nowhere, because now it's situated in between Kimberley and the other areas. And this is where we see that class distinction and racial distinction, where with a need for cheap labor, the British began to utilize a system of taxation on the Africans. So Africans are going to be taxed just for their existence. They've lived there for generations upon generations, and now they're going to be taxed because they exist within South Africa. And to pay these taxes, they're going to have to go to work at the mines. Really significant shift here. But despite this new racial caste system that really benefited the Boers were not satisfied. They were frustrated with the British economic and political policies, and this is going to lead us right to the South African War. As the British attempt to seize control of the mines, the Boers or the Afrikaners reacted. They're attempting to consolidate the power and transform the Orange Free State. Unfortunately for them, that's where all the minerals were. So the British are like, oh, no, you don't. And this really initiated this really chaotic moment. The Boers are going to, even despite having a lot of a strong population. Unfortunately for them, they weren't able to really organize any regular troops in the way that you and I would understand. So they would utilize a series of guerrilla tactics, hide in holes, behind trees, utilizing the landscape. And the only way the British could really fight this was through scorched earth policy. This is devastating, not just for the guerrillas. It's actually really devastating for the Africans as we begin to see the scorched earth policy. Acres upon acres upon acres of land is now destroyed, forcibly displacing the Africans that live there, the Caucasian as well, the Bantus who have lived there for a millennium. They're now forced out because the resources are used up, and it created quote unquote empty lands. That quote unquote empty lands is really important in today's conversations about what's happening with President Trump. If you want to know more about that, check about the Afrikaner refugees. There's some really intriguing things that we can talk about. But regards that, we're going to continue to move on. And scorched earth really set up some devastating elements because the British really didn't know what to do with the Boers. They actually set up some concentration camps. The Boer concentration camps are really important to write down because the Boers are going to utilize this concentration camp to paint the British as uncivilized. And here we see what a Boer concentration camp looks like. The Boers were forced out of their homes, men, women, and families, even if the children, if they weren't fighting. I'm about to show you a very unsettling picture. So if you want to close your eyes real fast, you can do that, or just look away, and I'll tell you when we move on. But this is an image of a teenage girl. She's been starved to death within these British concentration camps of Boers. And the British attempted to use this as propaganda to prove that the Boers were savages themselves because they allowed their teenage daughters to starve like this. Well, this is a pretty big lie because fortunately, there was a British journalist who was able to realize, unearth what was really happening. And then it really turned the tables. Once it realized that it was the British policies that created this, and again, we see this image that looks very much like a Holocaust victim. It is a concept, and this dates back to this Boer War or South African War, and it really turned the table. And this is when the British are going to they're going to be forced to kind of settle with the Boers or Afrikaners. And what do we see? By 1910, the Union of South Africa is formed as part of the British Commonwealth. The British the agreement is that they're going to control the mines. So the British are going to reap the rewards of the golden diamonds, while the Afrikaners control the government. That's got self-governance. South Africa now becomes part of the British Commonwealth, just like Canada was part of the British Commonwealth. So we see this kind of new imperial policy, part of that new imperialism. This is the flag of the Union of South Africa. But here we see, once again, the Africans are denied their rights. Despite fighting on the British side, despite them losing so much land, despite their sacrifices, the Africans are going to become seen as second-class human beings, not second-class citizens. That will be a different total talk conversation. but they're going to be seen less than. That idea of social Darwinism is really going to sweep the way, and Africans are going to be seen as lesser than. I do want to equate this maybe to the Middle East at the outcome of the First World War. Very similar, as the Arabs felt frustrated, so the Africans have felt frustrated. And now we have gotten into 1910, where we're now really ready to start talking about how the segregation led to apartheid. This brings us into our lecture. I hope that makes sense. Have a great day.